Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world, welcome back to The Caring Economy with me, Toby. Today I have as my guest a friend and colleague, Michael Marinello. He is the Chief Communications Officer for Aon, the multinational but British-American financial services firm. We got to know each other first when we worked on the Mike Bloomberg presidential campaign, and then our paths crossed again more recently this summer at a corporate communications executive retreat. And at that point, I also learned something I never knew before, which is he's a rock and roll star himself. So welcome to The Caring Economy, Mike Marinello.
Thanks, Toby. It's great to be here. And I thought you knew that, but I'm glad we were able to uncover that and bring it to light so that you now know and can appreciate it.
Well, there's so much that we had to absorb back in the day on the campaign. So maybe I did know it, but I'm glad to be reminded of it. And also you went to Lehigh, which we'll talk about today. But first, we always ask our guests to just give us sort of like the 2-minute digest of their lives, where they were born, where they grew up, how they were raised, how they got where they got. You tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, so I was born in Jackson Heights, Queens, actually the only member of my family on my dad's side and on my mother's side as well that was not born in the same hospital in Brooklyn. So I think I was born to do different things, period, right? I was the only person in my family on both sides, cousins, aunts, uncles, who weren't born in the same hospital in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. So Jackson Heights, Queens. I think a big changing point in my life was when my parents decided, but at the time of I was about 5 years old, we moved to the suburbs. We moved to a town called Millburn Short Hills, New Jersey. And I don't think you can get further away from Jackson Heights, Queens than Millburn Short Hills, but I didn't know that as a kid. And I just knew that it was not the city anymore. And I grew up in this amazing community with this amazing group of people. And I was just exposed to so much that I just thought every kid was. I thought every town was Millburn, and I thought every town was Short Hills. And it was, you find out later when you go to college that that's not the case, but I was just lucky. And I mean it in many ways, meaning that, we were a bedroom community of New York. And so, my friends' dads were the head of American Express and, the head of E.F. Hutton and things of that nature. And I just thought that everyone's, but I also had friends whose dads were the chief of police and chief of fire. And so we just were this great mix of people, and everyone, it was just a great time to grow up and a great place to grow up. But I just, I got exposed to so much just from a sense of it was an idyllic Mayberry community, where to this day my graduating class was 300 people, and I would say 250 of us stay in close contact on a regular basis thanks to social media, just to keep in touch, have a community, see how everyone's doing. And it was that kind of experience. Went through the school system there. My dad was an executive in Manhattan in the insurance finance world. And my mom was which was a huge influence for me. She was a teacher in the school system in town. And I remember thinking, the one thing that always stuck out with me, everyone thought it was odd that my mom worked, and she just did it because she loved teaching and she was born to be a teacher. And there was no anything else other than that. And it was fun to have her be a teacher in the community because, one, she was known, but then two, I sort of had this, watchcloth over my tower. So I would say growing up, the two biggest influences in my life were that my mom being a teacher and being a part of that community, and I had a brother who was 4 years older than me, who was pretty much just this unique, blend of amazing athlete and ridiculously smart guy. And while plowing a path for me, also cast a shadow. And it actually, at a very early age, made me realize I had to find my own path somewhere else, because everyone was always just expecting me to either be or do what he did. And it wasn't him. Obviously, the beauty of that was that it wasn't coming from him or my family. So I never felt the burden of what some people might feel of growing up under the shadow of someone. I just knew, just from expectations and such, that I was going to have to grow my own path. But lesson one was my brother went to Lehigh and so did I. So it took me a while. Went from Millburn to Lehigh. We were talking about it before, but I went to Lehigh because I wanted to be an architect, and Lehigh is an engineering school, or at least was back then. It's really an engineering and business. It's pretty much a multifaceted university right now, but then it was primarily, we were even called the Lehigh Engineers.
Well,
that was our nickname.
My brother, who I followed, went to Lehigh. I almost went to Lehigh, so I had a shadow thing going on as well.
We used to joke about, striking fear into the heart of our opponents, because the mascot was this guy surveying land, how it wasn't even a train engineer or anything even. It was a guy surveying land. Like, yeah, how intimidating could that be? That's why I went to Lehigh, because wanted to be an architect and wanted to go to an engineering school where the path was much more direct. I think there's like a 5-year apprenticeship expectation after you graduate, but once you get out of Lehigh, you're really sort of on your way. So that's why I went there, but it didn't work out. And about a year into it, I pivoted into international relations. And I think that sort of was, again, another turning point for me, where I found something that I was really good at. And I remember talking to a professor who said to me, you should pursue international relations. You're really good at it. And I was like, you can do that? You can actually do this is something, right? You don't have to do something that's going to make sure that when you get out, you get a job. Like, you can actually study something you're really good at or interested in. So that was, that was really interesting point for me. So yeah, so I went to Lehigh, got out, like everyone else, got into finance because that's what everyone was doing at the time. And I hated it. About 2 years into doing finance, decided I wanted to go to Washington, D.C. And there's a whole backstory. So you can ask me about like how I got there, but I went from finance to Washington, D.C., spent 7 years in the Senate, and then I was off to the races. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, so a couple of follow-up questions, and I say this somewhat form way. My ex was Italian Catholic guy, born in Brooklyn, raised in Staten Island. And I wonder, with the last name Marinello, is Italian culture an important part of your upbringing?
Yeah, it was, but it was more like being an Italian in America. We didn't feel like connected to Italy, but it was like, what was the Italian American experience? My grandfather, my dad's dad, was a first-generation immigrant from Sicily, and he was the chief law clerk for the Supreme Court of New York for 25 years.
Wow.
And his wife, my grandmother, was a woman suffragist. And I still have a picture. I still have the picture of her on the front page of the New York Times lobbying for the women's right to vote and picketing. So you see my political background, Toby, is genetic. Culturally, Italian American, growing up as an Italian American, was hugely influential, but it was not about Italy. It was about the immigrant experience.
Yeah, and it was almost assimilated as well. Like, and
it was about family. It was about something bigger than yourself. I think I always look back at this, but one of the most impactful thing for me was being brought up, and I mean this in the best way, by a group of strong women. Mm-hmm. I think that was just I feel amazingly lucky to have been brought up by a group of strong women where, always, and I know this sounds silly, but like, when you think about our generation and how many issues, with male and female and, gender and all that other stuff, I just never grew up with this sense that one was different than the other. Everyone had their role. I was always, so it was really interesting for me. Yeah. And I was the youngest cousin. So I had all women cousins, both sides. And I had all, except for one, I had one male cousin. And I had all, my aunts were all, successful. And my grandmother was. So it was just this very interesting part of, and it was an Italian American thing. So, they were also, when you think about it, they were breaking out of the stereotype.
Sure, of course.
They were breaking out of the stereotype. So it was fun to watch them be strong, not just as women in society, but in the family, and having a leading point of view. So that was really informative for me.
That would definitely seem consistent with my ex's family and others I know. And then another part, I don't know if it starts before Lehigh or during Lehigh. I spent a lot of time on fraternity row there, as you did when we were both applying. The rock and roll part of your life. Tell us a little bit about that, because that's pretty awe-inspiring.
Yeah, so thanks for it. Well, so it's interesting. So my dad, besides being a successful businessman, was also a big band jazz drummer. And so he was the house drummer at the Latin Quarter, if you remember the Latin Quarter, which was sort of the peer to the Copacabana back in the day. And so my drumming comes from him, and there was always drums in the house. I remember even when we were in the apartment in Jackson Heights, there was always a practice pad. And there's a picture of me at 4 years old playing the drums. And I just picked up the drums naturally, never really took a lesson. It was around the time of, I think we were my junior year in high school, a bunch of friends of mine were like, what's a great way to get girls to talk to you if you're sort of awkward? And we're like, be a rock band. Like, let's get a rock band. Together, so we just for the fun of it, and God bless my dad, we had the drum set in the basement, and he would let the guys come and play, and we started out just doing it for fun. And then I remember a friend of mine came over and he heard us play, like, we knew 5 songs, and he was a guy who always had like the party at his house, right? And we'd always have a basement. He said, you guys have to come and play in the basement one night, and we're like, no. And that's how it started. Our friend just said, and by the way, we played 5 songs. We played a 5-song set 3 times for the same crowd. And they got more and more excited each time because we got better and better each time. And that's how it all started. And then my friend who was the lead singer, a guy named Jimmy White, who was brilliant guy, is a brilliant guy, was a great athlete, wound up going to Dartmouth. But when we reconvened in the city, we had a very successful high school band career. Our band was really big. We started to play at big parties. We got, well, it was funny. Well, everyone went the path of like Van Halen and Led Zeppelin. We decided we were going to be opposite. So we went the way of the Police and Genesis and Tom Petty and the Stray Cats and the Doors. And we were playing. And so we were this unique, different band, Squeeze. So it started there. And then when Jim and I reunited after college, although it was funny, I would go up to Dartmouth and we would jump in and play at like a fraternity party
or something.
Yeah, we'd sit in and we'd play and we'd do our songs and knock the place out. And we had a lot of fun. When we got out of college, we were both, we were living together in the city, and we decided we'd start a band. Started a band with this group called the Off Wall Street Jam, which was a management firm that was trying to find people who were like businessmen by day and musicians at night. And so they would book us in clubs and all this other stuff. And it just took off. It was, we were an incredible, they put us together with musicians. We became a cover band. We were like, I'm dating myself, but we were on WNEW FM as sort of like they had us on. They had us play at festivals. We would do. So yeah, it just sort of snowballed. But it was something that started because my friend, back when we were 15 years old, my friend and I in the cafeteria decided we were going to come up with this idea.
What's the name of the band now?
God, there's been so many different permutations, and Jim no longer sings and I'm in a whole other world, although it's with some of those guys I met back when Jim and I started. Actually, the guitar player and I knew one of my current guitar player's friends is the guitar player that was playing with us way back then. But it's called Daughters and Dissidents, and that's a whole other story about how we became a Pearl Jam cover band. So we have two residencies, if you will. We play at Arlene's Grocery in the city, and we play at a place called Connolly's in Times Square. And that's where actually the Bloomberg campaign team came to see us. But my past, like we did, like in the first permutation, like we were on MTV. We were back when there was a club called the Lone Star Roadhouse that we were the opening act.
Let's use that to go back to the day job. How did you find, or how do you keep a balance between this passion, this hobby of yours, and your day job?
Well, you know what? It goes back to when I was 19. You know how record labels put bands together. They find different musicians and they push you together, see if you're any good, and you do a demo and then see where it goes. And so a different friend of mine who was a singer got me involved in this project for CBS Records. And we spent an entire day doing a demo tape. It was me and him and then these three other guys who I'd never met before, all really phenomenal musicians, and we sounded incredible. But it was something out of a bad movie where, like, in between takes, the lead guitar player, who called himself the King, was going into the bathroom and doing drugs with these two models, and he'd come out and he'd do it. And I was just like, and what should have taken an hour took 8 hours.
Okay.
And I just remember packing up my stuff and saying, I want nothing to do with this as a career. If this is what it's going to be, like, I'm out. I went happily back to college and, another semester of football. And I was like, I'm fine. I don't want to be a rock star. So I made a conscious decision that I loved it enough that I was always going to do it, but I would never wanted to ever do it to have to rely on, because then I would hate it right. And so I sort of saw that balance where this is always going to be my passion and never going to be my occupation.
Got it. So stick with the occupation then. You go down to Washington, you're working on the Hill, and then eventually you make your way into the private sector. I think you were working originally somehow with Mike's foundation, setting that up.
Oh, wow. So I was 7 years. So here's what it was interesting. So 7 years in the Senate, and how I got into press was I started as a legislative guy, but I was working for Pat Moynihan, a guy named Kevin Sheekey. Kevin was working there, and he saw that I had this interest and talent for writing and talking, as you can tell. And he drafted me into Pat's press office as part of my work. And then I just realized I was really good at this and I wanted to do this. And so that's how the press and sort of PR and branding and comms thing took off. But my first job off of the Hill was actually consulting for Microsoft on their antitrust case. Then I took a role. I was like, no, I'm done with, I understood what it was like to be a consultant, liked it, but I was sort of done with DC. So I wound up going to work for Gray. advertising and starting, they had a PR firm called GCI, and they had me start a government affairs and crisis practice. So it was great because I got to learn how to be an entrepreneur and a businessman while doing something I liked within a large organization.
Yeah.
So then I did Gray. And then what happened was a client of mine hired me to leave Gray and go start global PR for them. It was a med tech firm called Becton Dickinson. And then almost like 6 years to the day, I got a call from Microsoft, from the same guys I'd been consulting with. And they said, we have a job for you. We want you to come move to Seattle. So left, and it was with Brad Smith, who was the general counsel, who's now the president of Microsoft, but it was with him working on intellectual property. So that got me to Seattle. And then about 4 years into it, I was back in New York, and I was having coffee with Kevin, who we'd stayed in touch over years, friends. I'd done a lot of stuff. I'd volunteered on Mike's 2 mayoral campaigns prior, and I'd done a lot of stuff. So it wasn't completely out of the blue. And Kevin and I had always stayed in touch. Actually, even when Mike came to Microsoft, I led the tour for him. I set it up, and I was his tour guide, and we went around Microsoft. And so always had been connected. But I was having coffee with Kevin one day. He had just left City Hall, and he said, I have a job for you. And he said, Mike's starting a foundation, and we want you to come join us and, launch it, run comms and all. So that's how I got to Mike's.
Got it.
That's how I got there.
I mean, you talk about Moynihan and Microsoft and Kevin Sheekey, who's a great executive in the Bloomberg empire to this day. What can you say about leadership that you've, in my view, you've chosen great leaders to hook your caboose to, and are a leader yourself, but any reflections on leadership or how you used your noggin to choose the really credible ones, the successful ones for the long haul?
Yeah, I think what I learned from Moynihan was be forever intellectual curious, right? And always learn something, and always know that you can help others learn. If you looked at what Pat Moynihan did and you ascribed a business and numbers to it, that's what he was. He was an entrepreneur, but it was a frame of mind, and that's what I learned from him. Like entrepreneurship, or a friend of mine called me an intrapreneur, which means being an entrepreneur inside other organizations. But if that's a friend of mine called me that. But I think that's what I learned from Pat. And then I always stayed that way, where I always wanted to be someplace where I felt like I was going to learn more, do more, and have an impact. And I learned that from being Pat's special assistant, and getting to sit next to brilliance and greatness. That I was just fortunate, very lucky. But yeah, that's what I learned. I mean, so the leaders, I think you can draw a line and see connectivity. So like I see a lot of similarities between Mike Bloomberg and Pat, even though they're completely different, just in the way they think and operate. A lot of similarities between Bill Gates and Mike. I was fortunate enough to work directly with Bill a couple of times right before. It was right when he was leaving Microsoft, but I got a couple of opportunities to work with him directly, which I didn't go there to do that, but I just was able to because the gentleman who recruited me, Larry Cohen, who was the head of comms there, and he's now Bill's chief of staff. He plays a very similar role in Bill's world that Kevin does in Mike's world. Said, you can do this. I need you to do this. And he had me, did some work directly with Bill, got to know, brief, talk to him, sit in and stuff. So I think there's just this curiosity and intellect that I've seen with leaders that have always attracted me to being and working there. And I'll never forget my first encounter with Bill Gates in his office. And he had no idea who I was or what I was doing there, other than Larry had brought me. I remember saying something because it was awkwardly silent in the room. The book Outliers? So that was one of the things I got to work on with Bill. I actually briefed him and sat next to him while he gave that interview. I love that book because it's really interesting, but I love that book because there's the whole Bill Gates part where I was literally sitting next to him while he was giving that interview to Malcolm Gladwell. So it was pretty cool. But I remember Malcolm was late and it was completely awkward and no one was saying anything. And I just blurted out something. I don't know what I said, just to like break the ice because it was driving me crazy. And he just looked at me like, who are you? Why are you talking in my presence? Right? and I remembered that look. And then he asked me a question because I had written the briefing. And I just remembered, I was like, my mind went back to working for Moynihan. Yeah. And I was like, I got this. I know exactly where this is going. He wants to know if I'm smart enough and have any great, and I can handle it and I should be in the room with it. And so he drilled me on like 4 or 5 questions. And as soon as I was done, he like completely, he chilled out. He was awesome. We had a lot of fun and blah, blah, blah. But so like, I've been able to sort of take lessons and sort of apply them forward. But that's what I would say from leadership. It's like, intellectual curiosity and this sense of entrepreneurship, right? Where you're always looking to do more and see more. And
ladies and gentlemen, again today on the Caring Economy, we have Michael Marinello with us. He is a Chief Communications Officer for Aon, the big British American financial service giant. He's also a rock and roll cover brand star. Tell us a little bit more about your role at Aon. What does comms mean in a big multinational like that?
Well, just to be sure, because if my boss is ever listening or watching, my actual role is head of global communications and content, which is, you can make the equivalency, but it's head of communications and content. It's been just a great, couple of years at Aon. I started as a consultant, sort of very similar path in my career, Toby. You come in as a consultant, they ask you to come on board. But it's been great because they brought me in to really change the way the firm goes to market from a communications perspective. Mm-hmm. And Andy Whites leads the organization. He's the CMO and has really done an amazing job over his tenure in changing the way Aon thinks about itself and goes to market from a marketing perspective and as a brand perspective. Mm-hmm. And then, what Andy realized was that, I don't want to speak for him, but I think why I'm there is that the second sort of, hill to climb after that was, how do we communicate and what's the story behind the firm and how do we, present ourselves and what's our story? And that's why, that's what it means to Aon, right? Communications. So I run communications and content, which, you would say is basically perhaps maybe like the voice of the firm and how we show up, where we show up, what we're saying about ourselves, what we're saying about, and to our colleagues, what we're saying about what we bring to our clients, and then where we show up is what it's all about. And we're in the process of changing that. So, the communications right now at the firm is helping with this change management of just the firm in general and evolving into the new world and sort of the place the firm wants to go. That's what it means for the firm. And I think it's important because what we've done is really changed the dynamic with all the craziness in the news cycle right now and how fractured the media is. What we've really done is flip the dynamic and not only become our own creators and publishers, but controlling the distribution. Right. And that's what we do from a comms and content standpoint, is really have really acute understanding of our distribution, who we're communicating to, why and how, and what's the impact. How do we change that if necessary?
Yeah, I note, at least on your site currently, I think your purpose is we shape decisions for the better to protect and enrich the lives of people around the world. We believe that businesses thrive when the communities they serve and the people they employ also flourish. You can control your message and the distribution, but still things get out and into others' hands that aren't necessarily your stakeholders. But how do you deal with detractors in this highly politicized world in which we live now, where one person could say that it's not the role of a business to care about X, Y, and Z or ESG, and then you do. So how do you avoid getting into the fray there?
One of the great things about the firm is that, we have an amazing CEO in Greg Case, who's been with the firm for 15 plus years and as CEO. And so the firm has a strong personality and sense of who it is. It's now really just communicating that more broadly. So we stay in our lane, right? And I think that's the easiest way to sum it up. I had this great conversation when we were together in Utah with the woman who runs comms for Levi's. And we were talking and I said, we're not Levi's, right? And she was saying to me, appropriate for them to be out speaking on the things they speak to because it's their employee base and it's who they're selling to. And so they know their lane. And it's knowing our lane and knowing that, we're in 120 countries with 50,000 employees, right? We serve almost, everybody could or can be a client. And so you have to be really in tune to who you are as a firm and what your role is and what your place is in the marketplace to make sure that the things you're doing and saying have weight and make sense. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's how we, like I said, at the end of the day, we stay in our lane.
Yeah.
Right. And understanding what that is. And, you step out of it a little bit, once in a while when we know we should or can or feel comfortable that it's the right way to go. There's nothing wrong with incremental gain if there's a goal at the end of it. Right.
Yeah. So let's think about some of the issues of the day, whether it's social justice in the wake of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's murder, or the impact of COVID and the pandemic, or #MeToo movement. How do those issues get addressed internally as well as externally for Aon? Any one of them?
Well, I think what we've learned in this era of social upheaval is that we need to be thinking about our colleagues as much as our clients in this situation and the general public. And so we always look at how are these things, we look at both, right? And that's how, so there's no playbook other than let's look at how these issues are affecting our clients, how they're affecting our colleagues, and how they might affect, what we're supposed to do as a firm. And we come up with, there's no playbook for these times right now. It's just incredibly volatile and incredibly, anything can happen, whether it's weather or geopolitical or any time societal. So we really, we have we have a great sense of who we are as a firm. And then when any of these things happen, we come together and look at those three areas and say, what's the appropriate way for us to respond?
Yeah.
And there's no one size fits all. And I think we're also learned from our colleagues, certain examples, some of the issues based on just how the firm works and the culture of the firm. Some of these examples, which might feel like we need to say something much bigger, actually are best handled locally and then shared broadly with how we handled them locally, as opposed to making everything firm-wide all the time.
I share that approach, or that view on that approach. And I wonder also, in my writing and in my show, I actually think that way forward, the best training, the best solution is exercising these muscles and these skills that we have as communicators with the various issues that we do. So whether it's ESG, sustainability, accessibility, the more you're regularly asking yourself as a brand, as an employee, how can we be better at this? What do we need to understand here? The better prepared we'll be for any incoming, whether it's, a disaster relief effort or, another horrible another shooting, or, you're right. You can never anticipate the exact next crisis when it's to come. But if you have your employees, particularly your comms people, thinking about and exercising that part of the brain that says, all right, the who, what, when, where, why of mapping out a crisis, that is an exercise that you get better and better at, frankly, by doing it.
Absolutely. And I think too, understanding the different nuances and the ways to communicate and whom to communicate and the different feedback mechanisms that help. We're learning on a daily basis, like what different, what things are working, what things aren't working. We are, and I've always been heavily reliant on data and analytics to show not just output of communications, but impact. And so we do pulse surveys all the time with our colleague base. We do, quarterly surveys, into the marketplace about how our messages are resonating. We do weekly analysis of how our content's performing. So I think if you have, and, I've always sort of been data driven, although working for Mike made it, essential just in my day. He always used to say, he still does. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Right. And that's the truth. There's nothing more truer than that. So if you don't know what you're trying to achieve, how do you know you're achieving it?
I know there are a lot of turnkey solutions out there, but I think most brands are still challenged to try and find ways to succeed in measuring and monitoring what they're doing, their messaging.
Well, I think, and I think the whole thing is understanding like what's the impact you're trying to have, and then how do you measure whether that impact is happening?
Yeah.
And I think, and that sounds really simplistic. It is and it isn't. I mean, the challenge I've always had is with both, the places I've worked, my teams, and in the whatever platforms or vendors you're using, is that I know what I need, right, to measure. So I need you to help me measure it. Yes. I don't need you to tell me, right? I know what I'm measuring and I know what I want. And I think having that frame of mind helps, if that makes sense.
I'm reminded also, I just got an email today from Kyle Dopp at Morning Consult, and they excel at that. So covered a lot already. Two last questions for you, Mike. One Sure. is words of wisdom for either young professionals starting out, college kids, maybe Lehigh graduates this year, or even more senior professionals who perhaps have been disrupted or feeling stuck in their career. And the other is when your next gig is. So go ahead with the first.
So next gig is October 21st at Connolly's at Times Square at 8:30. So they're $10 at the door. Advice though, I think the experience I will share is twofold. I think one, I just always was never afraid to try something new. I was never afraid of failing because what did Edison say? I didn't fail to make a light bulb 99 ways. I found 99 ways not to make a light bulb, right? Tell how you take it. So I've always never been afraid of sort of not succeeding right away, because I just feel like the experience is better and more worth it than, speaking of Lehigh University, they have this mountaintop campus where it's this interdisciplinary learning, and I'm a innovator in residence there. And I go and I speak to the students about once a quarter, and they ask me what failure looked like. right? They were having a similar conversation about your career and blah, blah, blah. And they said to me, what does failure look like to you? And I said, failure to me is not trying.
Trying, absolutely.
Not trying. So failure to me is not trying. I tell my kids this. I have 2 teenage boys. I don't care if they don't succeed in the way that they want to. What I care about is they don't try.
Yeah.
Right.
Agreed.
Trying to me, not trying to me is failure. So that would be my counsel.
Yep.
You know, if you're looking to do something new, then try it. What's the worst thing that can happen? It doesn't work out. But guess what? You realize that it didn't work out. You didn't fail. It just didn't work out.
And that's also, I think, in the same school of thinking as those great leaders we've talked about today, from Moynihan to Bloomberg to Shiki. So Mike Marinello, thank you so much for joining us on The Caring Economy. I'm going to come see you in Times Square this fall. I'm going to bring some of my mutual friends along. Again, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Toby.